poverty and un-British rule in India, Dadabhai Navroji, this of course is one of the fundamental texts for freedom fighters at that time, because it exposed how British exploited India economically, and economic history of India by Datta, and finally village communities, my name. I thought I must give this sort of a bibliography, because it is also an indication of influence on Gandhi's mind. Now let me talk about his two cardinal principles: truth and non-violence. Sarvodaya and Satyagraha I won't touch at this point, but truth and non-violence I do. But Gandhi's truth was primarily his own truth, and hence postmodernists also locate him in the discourse of postmodernism. So it was not a rational, scientific, logical truth. It was not. So it was his own truth, but the essence of his truth was morality. That's what he says. But one thing took deep root in me: the conviction that morality is the basis of things, and that truth is the subject of all morality. Truth became my magnitude. No, truth became my sole objective. It began to grow in magnitude every day, and my definition of it also has been ever widening. Now, this is where we have rather his journey from truth to truth, and also expansion of his understanding of truth. He also compares truth with diamond. As the diamond has many dimensions, so also truth has many dimensions. It is only one aspect of diamond we can see. Perhaps we can only see one dimension of Gandhi. Then he makes a shift. Suddenly he says, again in the discourse of truth, he says, to see the universal and all pervading spirit of truth face to face. If you intend to see truth face to face, so this is what truth means to Gandhi. One must be able to love. One must be able to love the meanest of creation as oneself. One must be able to love the meanest of creation as oneself. So it's a radical shift. It's a radical shift. Of course, he did talk about Advaitic truth, Dvaitic truth, etc., etc. That is also an interesting continuation, in fact. But this is a significant point he is trying to make. He is primarily realizing his truth in human beings. And if and human beings as the manifestation of truth, all human beings, and of course there have been major debates about discrimination and dispute, which the following papers will deal with. He also read something of Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, of Western humanist and rationalist literature, but with typically Indian Catholicity, he tried to accommodate other schools of thought as well. It's interesting if we speak in pure philosophical terms. In a remarkable passage, this is a passage from another book. This is A.L. Basham's book. In a remarkable passage, he admitted the influence of typically Jaina doctrine of Anekantavada. So this is a key philosophical term I am mentioning, Anekantavada. And it is also interesting, and that goes well with Gandhian thought, because Gandhi makes it his own. He takes what he wants primarily based on his experience and gives his own interpretation. Anekantavada, which implied, it's very interesting, which implied that a proposition might be true or false at the same time. A proposition may be true or false at the same time from two relative points of view. A proposition may be true or false at the same time from two relative points of view. And he immediately connects it with Dvaita, Advaita, etc. I am an Advaitist. You see what he says. I am an Advaitist. And yet I can support Dvaitism. You can also call it inconsistency. It's no problem. It's fine. The world is changing every moment. And is therefore unreal. It has no permanent existence. In that sense, it is an Advaitic position. World is also changing every moment. But though it is constantly changing, it has something about it which persists and it is therefore to that extent real. So this is Dvaita philosophy, in fact. This is Dvaita. Constantly changing, there is something about it which persists and it is therefore to that extent real. This is also real. So he can be a Dvaitist and an Advaitist at the same time. That's what he's saying. And then he continues, because this is exactly what then he connects it with the Jaina philosophy of Anekantavada. A proposition can be true or false at the same time from two relative points of view. But he extends it to the practical life. I will come to that. I have therefore no objection to calling it real or unreal and thus being called an Anekantavadi. This is what Gandhi says. Anekantavadi or Syadvadi is the same. But my Syadvada, this is the key point. My Syadvada or Anekantavada is not learned. It is not the Anekantavada of the learned. It is peculiarly my own. It is peculiarly my own. And applied to practical life, and this is what he believed and practiced. So one connection Basham gives, I thought I would mention. And hence, persons like Ramakrishna Paramahamsa could see that all religions are equally true. So you need not accuse another religion as being wrong, because even now and even then, these religious disputes were quite rampant and prominent. And finally, of course, nation was divided on religious lines in one sense, and we suffered this mass, huge tragedy of partition. But extending this philosophy of a proposition can be true or false at the same time from two relative points of view. For him, also, all religions are equally true. All religions are equally true, but he also makes a correction. He also says all religions also have certain errors. All religions are equally true, but all religions also have certain errors, and hence there is a need for all religions to exist, and they can complement perhaps. All religions have certain errors. He says that also. See how he makes his own philosophical thought. Now, non-violence. There has been much debate, dispute about non-violence. Gandhi did not advocate violence as a creed. So he was, in that sense, an advocate of non-violence. He also puts it in the great tradition of Buddha, of Zoroaster, of Mahavir, of Jesus, of Muhammad, of Nanak, etc., etc. Of course, the Vaishnava tradition, the Jaina tradition, the ascetic tradition, that did have certain influence on Gandhi's non-violence, but still it was also different. Sermon on the Mount strengthens his belief in non-violence, which is also confirmed in South Africa by the study of Tolstoy. But his unique contribution, so far as non-violence was concerned, it was not primarily an individual ascetic practice. He extended it to the practical politics. So it was also an instrument of his mass movements. So that is where Gandhi's contribution lies. It was a major experiment, a great experiment, undoubtedly. Somebody has written a book titled as Gandhi, a Sublime Failure. A sublime failure. It's not just a failure. So he was also visualizing something like smallest army possible. Smallest army possible. He responded to certain immediate situations. Yes, be it Boers War or the First World War. So he was also helping the injured soldiers as a nurse in Boers War. He did that. But he was also convinced that if violence as an ideology becomes means of achieving anything, be it even political independence. And his fear was violence may perpetuate, violence may continue. Those who replace power by violence, they may perpetuate violence. Yes, he has also made statements like, and this is also, and theorists have said that Gandhi did have exceptions with regard to non-violence. Of course, non-violence is a very important creed next only to truth for him. And he has made comments like, because someone asks him, if somebody is being raped in front of you, how does your non-violence help? And again, this is Gandhi, and he says, violence is better than cowardice. Violence is better than cowardice. But he doesn't approve violence as an ideology, as a means of achieving political goals, because for him it was once again the possibility of perpetuation of violence. I will just conclude with what he did with Bhagavad Gita, because in the passage I read out earlier, he says that finally Bhagavad Gita, the song Celestial, that was a major influence on him. Generally considered, Bhagavad Gita, of course, was either recited or preached or whatever at the time of war, in the middle of the war, in the battlefield. And of course, there has been an argument that it was also of the war. But Gandhi completely subverts this argument. He comes up with his own argument. And this is what the post-modernist call as some kind of a postmodern hermeneutic. So it is his own interpretation, a truth, what he has got from Bhagavad Gita. He has written a very fine introduction to his translation of Gita. He has translated, he has given his interpretation. He calls it as Anasakti Yoga. Anasakti Yoga is the discipline of non-attachment, a kind of a detached action. So action he was never removed from. For him it was not an intellectual exercise. To intellectualize Gandhi is a sin in one sense. He was a practical idealist. He was, in that sense, a hardcore, hard-boiled practitioner and an activist. Action was more important. So finally, the essence of Gita for him is action. That is the disinterested action. It is not Dvaita or Advaita or any philosophical thought. And for him, Gita is not a sacred text. Gita is not a sacred text. For him, Gita is a poem. For him, Mahabharata is not historical. For him, Gita is not historical. See the subversion Gandhi does. point of view. But let me just take what I think. I find this meaning in Gita. So there is a possibility of multiple interpretation. If it is a poem, if it becomes a religious text, you cannot interpret, you cannot say a single word. You cannot say a single word on any religious text. You will be ransacked. I mean, there will be whole violence. You just can't say if it is a religious text. But for him, he says it's not a religious text. For me, who derives his inspiration from Gita, and he says not a religious text. And he says poet's meaning is limitless. If it is a poem, meanings are limitless. You can interpret in your way. Meanings of the words also have changed over the years. So the meaning that was prevalent during that time may not be there today. Let me think of the present meaning. What is true in one place or time may not be true in another place. And he also says he is very, very humble in that sense. He says, no, I am primarily writing this interpretation not for scholars, Gita. It is for women. It is for Shudras. It is for the commercial class. Those at that point of time are generally not exposed to letters, and it is for them. Of course, there could be another criticism to it, but I'm just mentioning because he is according to Shastras, women, Shudras, etc. were not entitled for ultimate enlightenment of the Shastras. They were not, they were kept outside Brahma Jnana, whatever you call. But he is primarily writing his interpretation for them, he says. So this is the Hinduism he is trying to grapple with. And in fact, so it's also a major debate, and somebody finally tells him, untouchability may have the sanction of the Shastras, or it is. Someone says it doesn't have, someone says it does have the sanction of the Shastras of Hinduism. So he says, in such case, then I will have to rethink about Shastras. I will have to rethink about Hinduism. So if there is a sanction for untouchability in the Shastras and Hinduism, then I reject that Hinduism and I reject that Shastra. So that's why in the beginning I said he was not scriptural. He went beyond the scriptures. Of course, he did read scripture. Of course, he did not read Vedas and all that. But whatever he read, from, he finally deduced his own interpretation because that was based on his experience and what he saw. So he was not hesitant to say that he could reject Shastras if it becomes inhuman. Because it is the same Shastra which kept women and Shudras outside the purview of knowledge and normal life. And here he is saying that he is writing the interpretation of Bhagavad Gita for them. And what he deduces from it finally, yeah, it is not a historical text for him, but he also says, Mahabharata would have happened, I have no problem, but not in the same manner as it is written. Krishna would have existed, but not in the same manner. Krishna is an imagination, he says. Gandhi says, Krishna is an imagination. Krishna is perfection. But that perfection is imaginary, not a historical perfection. It's not a historical perfection. It is an imaginary perfection. It's an ideal. It's a perfection. But it is an imaginary perfection. It is an ideal to be reached, not historical. And finally, with regard to war, it's a very radical interpretation he believes in. This actual war would have happened or not happened and all that, I'm not much bothered. War is actually a duel that went on in the hearts of human beings. So that is his war. So today, there are different interpretations to jihad also. Jihad could mean anything, but jihad essentially could be a struggle within oneself to overcome certain qualities, certain tendencies. It was a metaphoric war. It was a war that happens within all of us. It is a war which happens within all of us between good and evil. So he was not talking about good and evil as two binary categories, someone as good and someone as bad. No. A good and evil that exists in all of us, and the constant conflict, the constant Mahabharata war that happens within us, within all of us, the constant struggle between evil and war, evil and good, good and evil. Perhaps the most radical interpretation let me just conclude with a few his own remarks. Which I have already mentioned, in fact, no need to repeat, but let me just read those sentences as they are. Even in 1888-89, I felt Gita was not a historical work, but that under the guise of physical warfare, it described the duel that perpetually went on in the hearts of mankind. That physical warfare was brought in merely to make the description of the internal duel more alluring. That's what he says. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hiregange.
So I'm Devi Prasad. I work with the RoboSoft Technologies here in Udupi. I had a couple of questions and an observation that here I haven't read much about Gandhi, or I haven't read anything about him actually. But I think Gandhi perhaps wasn't a scientist nor a philosopher. Probably he was a belief system, as you know. That's what I gather. He had a bunch of thoughts of his own, and he would practice it. So he was a belief system. in his own ways. So I have two questions that attracted my attention. So one was you said he had read about what is art by Tolstoy. So are there any works where Gandhi talks about art or elegance or design and things like that? Are there any works? Number one. Number two is I always felt that I hope I'm wrong here. I always felt that uh, towards the end, British were tired, right? Because a lot of changes that were taking place in England and stuff like that. My fear is that Gandhi worked during those days, worked because British were tired. What do you think, in the current context of it's a really complex world today, in the real sense of the word, right? It's our battles are different. Uh, he was talking about interdependence. So this interdependence is very subtle. On the one hand, we oppose many things, but on the other hand, we have to have economic ties with nations, with neighboring countries, and so it's very subtle. It's not a dichotomy. It's not, you know, compartmentalization or silos, or there are no such silos, in fact. So things work across in different levels, of abstraction. So I have two questions. I'm sorry. I'm supposed to ask one, but I'm asking two. One is about the art, and another is what is his thought? Did Gandhi work because British were tired, and probably it wouldn't work that effectively today? Thanks.
Hi, Dr. Monish. I teach here at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. It's not a question, but it's kind of my observation because a lot has been said about the consistency and inconsistency thing, and then especially on Gandhi's views on World War II. I think if we were to really find consistency in political leaders or societal leaders all around the world, be it so-called successors of Gandhian thought like Martin Luther or many others like Nelson Mandela that you have mentioned. If you were to find consistency in one person, either you were to find it in God or either in devil, in the consistency of the devilishness and the consistency of the goodness. But even epics, whether they are Indian or whether they are Greek, have told that gods are inconsistent. Even devils are inconsistent. So I don't find the relevant, I don't find the importance of really looking for one consistent thought process. It just defeats the dialectic of any political revolution. If you look at even World War II, you said Gandhi was trying to regroup troops and all. I think we need to look a little further into the dialectic of the process that was really going on within the Congress committee itself, as the changing nature of Gandhi's support or not support to the war. Because, despite all the principles and despite all the non-violence epithets that we talk about or ascribe to Gandhiji, I think we need also to look to the fact that there was a hard-nosed negotiation going on between the British government in the face of, World War II, as to what would be the implications of India's support to the war. What would we get out of that? And all that was talked about, for instance, in the Tripoli session, or the more specifically the Wada session in 1942, after which, we had the Quit India movement or the August Kranti that we talk about. I think we need to look into the fact that there was a hard-nosed negotiation going on, and in base of that negotiation, we need to look at the dialectic process that was going on, in which views change over a period of time, and towards in a matter of 6 weeks and 1 year, as World War II was evolving, I think Gandhi's views also started changing. There were many differences within the Congress party, within the national movement itself, as how were the communists looking at World War II? How were the socialists looking at World War II? How was the new forward bloc looking at World War II? Or even how was J.N. Nehru or even Gandhi looking at World War II? So I think it would be wrong on our part to just ascribe one position to one person and try to find consistency in that. It would defeat the complexity and the dialectic process of any political negotiation or revolution that was happening in that period of time. So I think that's. Thank you.
Yeah, about consistency stuff, consistency arguments. I don't think we should look for consistency, because even in science, inconsistency consistency comes at one level, but at the next level of abstractions, when you go even in science, the way we understand the world, at different levels of abstractions, things become inconsistent, and there is a next next level where it becomes, Newtonian physics, quantum mechanical world, and there are different levels. Uh, and you cannot give one single explanation to a phenomenon because there are biological explanations, there are psychological explanations, there are political explanations, right? So it's a complex system. So I I don't think we should harp on consistency. Inconsistency is true, right?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarsh. I'm a postgraduate scholar here at the Department of Geopolitics. Varadesh, throughout your lecture, you kept referring to uh, Gandhi as postmodernist scholar himself, how he reinterprets texts in his own way. Do you think, and like for scholars like me personally, if I believe I'm also a postmodernist constructivist, so do you think the time has come to look at Gandhi as Gandhi's work himself in a postmodernist sense? I think that's something that you didn't approach in that sense because the author is dead. Not just literally, but I'm talking about the postmodern sense. And I think we need to take that idea of him and place it in a context which I feel, or let's a scholar feel, should be relevant today. Say, for example, if I look at Gandhian text, for me, there's no philosophy in it. I look at it more of as a political text, as a leader who knew what he was doing, who knew the masses. Like the chair himself started in the beginning. He knew that perhaps the most important thing in any free, any revolution or movement is to ensure that people have food to eat. Because unless you guarantee employment, nobody is going to come and fight for you. So Gandhi knew that, and he knew how to get that done, and he knew, and it started with self-employment, charka and khadi and everything in that context. So I think the time. Do you think the time has come to look at the man through a postmodernist lens, his work through a postmodernist, take the idea and crux, and not just take history and replace it in the modern context?
Can you just repeat your last sentence?
Yeah, like take the man and take his idea, more of an essence,
Okay.
and not just take history and like just take it out of 1947 and place it in 2014.
Hello, so my name is Hamsini. I'm a master's student here. And my question is in addition to Arsh's question. So whenever we're talking about development and everyone goes back to Gandhi's notions of a village economy, we know that they are not applicable in today's context. But if you look at the definition of development, it's defined as maximum consumption. And uh, if, do you think we should take, as I said, the essence of Gandhi's text as looking at development as an alternative model, or just, or do you think the village economy is still relevant in today's? So if you could address that too.
Yeah, with regard to art, the work of art, what is art? That is Tolstoy's book. There is a very interesting episode which I suddenly remembered. Mulkraj Anand. Mulkraj Anand, of course, he goes to Europe and he studies there, and he was there for some time, and he was also part of this Bloomsbury intellectual group, of which even Virginia Woolf was a part. And there he also writes his Untouchable, the famous novel, Untouchable. And of course, he was always fascinated by Gandhi, and he wanted to meet Gandhi, and he wanted to show his work to Gandhi, and especially Gandhi was also working on untouchability and all that. So he comes to India and meets Gandhi and gives his book to Gandhi. And Gandhi reads the book, and this is Gandhi's comment, and he says, I don't know whether you have read that novel, Untouchable. It's a very important text. And Gandhi says that Bakha is the major character, protagonist in the novel, Bakha. So you have converted Bakha into a Bloomsbury intellectual. That's what Gandhi comments. You have converted Bakha into a Bloomsbury intellectual. And you are also too verbose. So you cut it down. You just cut it down. So it was a huge voluminous novel of more than 300, 400 pages. And I think because of Gandhi's comment, he in fact almost he cuts it down by more than 100 pages. And Gandhi's prose writing even today, of course, considered to be very simple and straight. Of course, majority of his writings were journalistic. He wrote for different newspapers, Harijan or Young India and Indian Opinion, etc. So his style, prose style, is in fact is really something that may be looked up to. And yes, he did not attempt any fiction in that sense, or any artistic work in that sense. But his Hinswaraj, itself is a kind of, it is not a fiction, but it is imaginary in to an extent, because he has attempted something fictional in that, something imaginary in that, because it is in the mode of a dialogue between the editor and editor and a reader. So like Bhagavad Gita, and like I think there is also another text similar to this of Plato, if I am correct, but so in the tradition of question and answer, so reader asks the question and editor responds. So he takes all the questions of the time, all the criticisms of the time, and he tries to respond. So to that extent, that we consider